Nebuchadnezzar has decided that now you will eat food that has been sacrificed to the Babylonian idols, and you will drink that has been sacrificed to the Babylonian idols, in the same way that a non-Christian would not take communion. That is an intensely Christian act. You are participating in worship as you eat. This is the difference between seeing billboards of semi-naked women as you drive around town and thinking, this is just a factor of me living in this society, and you turning on Netflix and choosing to watch movies where there are naked women in the movie. It's like, Daniel's like, I live in this society, but I'm not participating in this.
Do you think the Bible is just for holy Joes, or that you need a degree in religion to understand it? Have you ever thought, I need help to tackle such a sacred book? Well, I found someone who is so passionate about the Bible that you'll want to pick it up and give it a go. His name is Phil Moore. He's read it, studied it, written about it, and talked about it.
These two books of the Bible, I know we spent quite a bit of time on just two books of the Bible. They're really because we live in Babylon. The UK is not a Christian country. It's a secular space. And it's really easy for us to think that our faith in God is important for church and maybe important for family, but certainly not for work or studies or the secular sphere. We live in the equivalent of the Persian Empire. And God basically wants to use both of these two books of the Bible to say, there is not a square inch of planet Earth over which I do not proclaim that's mine.
I'm David Taverner, and in this series of podcasts, Phil is giving us a sort of bird's eye view of the Bible, looking at the key themes that will be really helpful if you've wanted to read it but kept putting it off, or if you've started and need some pointers. That's why the podcast is called The Bible Storyline Simplified. And as we follow that storyline from Genesis to Revelation, we hope that each of our conversations will inspire you to give the Bible your attention. As a quick recap, in the last couple of episodes, we've talked about the royal line of kings in the Old Testament and some of the prophets who were God's spokesmen.
There was some overlap between the last episode and the one before. The one before was the kings of ancient Israel and Judah, the northern and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom destroyed in 722 BC, the southern kingdom then destroyed in 586 BC. And the warning sirens episode, the last one, was the prophets who spoke into that situation, who basically served as warning sirens from God that all is not well, like the smoke alarm in your or my house saying, something's going wrong in the kitchen, you need to do something, otherwise your house is going to burn down. That's what the prophets did, and they were not listened to. And so in this episode, we are going to look at just two books of the Old Testament. We're going to look at Daniel and Esther. And what those two books have in common is that they are both in foreign ground. Daniel is in the land of Babylon during the Babylonian Empire. And then after the Babylonian Empire falls in 539 BC, we find Esther, who's part of the Persian Empire. So these are Jewish people. And from now on, they start being referred to as Jews because the people of Israel who were taken into exile never returned. The people of Judah, the southern kingdom, who were taken into exile, returned, and Jew comes from the word Judah. So we can now refer to these as the Jewish exiles in Babylon and Persia. And what we're going to discover is what they discovered when they tried to follow God in foreign ground for the first time.
Okay, now I think some of us have heard of Daniel, or the lion's den, and the fiery furnace. So we'll come on to that hopefully. But so Daniel is in Babylon. Just geographically, just help us. Where is that?
So Babylon's in the land of Iraq, so modern-day Iraq. So if you think back to the beginning of this series of broadcasts, we were looking at Abraham and God creating a family of God. And he called Abraham to leave Ur of the Chaldees, which was the most sophisticated, civilized city on earth, in order to go to the land of Canaan, in order to turn away from his false gods and to start following the God of Israel. And so what's happened by the time we reach the book of Daniel is that the people of Israel in the land of Canaan have stopped following the God of Israel and have started following pagan gods again. And so God brings them full circle just down the road from Ur of the Chaldees. They find themselves back in the land that Abraham left because God says, if you are not willing to learn the lesson, we're going to have to start over and I'll teach it you again.
History repeating itself,
shall we say? God brings up these same themes because even in our own day, isn't this the reality? You look at the church in the UK today and it seems weaker than you would expect it to be. And then you dig a little deeper into church life and you realize actually we're more contaminated by the false priorities and gods of our own age than we care to admit. And so these books are obviously hugely relevant to us because actually one of the key issues behind the decline of the church in the Western world has been that we've gone the way of one and two kings. And God's spoken to us through these warning sirens. And if we repent, then God wants to grow and bless his church and to restore his name in our nations.
So Daniel's in a part of the world, well away from the roots in the Promised Land, but God's not given up.
Well, no, and that's the big theme. For most people, they think he has. They think it's game over because the people of Israel had put God in a box a long time ago. God had dwelt above the Ark of the Covenant, which is essentially a gold box, in the Holy of Holies in the temple or the tabernacle, which is essentially a box. Inside the temple, the larger building, which was a box, inside Jerusalem, which was an urban box, inside the land of Judah, which was a national box. But essentially, they had said to themselves, this is how God operates. He doesn't operate out there. He operates in here. They had literally tried to put God in a box. And so Malachi says to them in his book of prophecies, God is great even beyond the borders of Israel. It's only when Daniel and Esther go to Babylon and then to Persia that they begin to realize that God could never be crammed into some tiny box, that actually there's no part of the earth and there's no part of our lives where God isn't God. Most of the people think the story's over, but Daniel and Esther discover the story's just beginning.
What do we know about Daniel? Do we know much about his upbringing?
Yeah, so Daniel was born into a noble house. He was part of the Jewish nobility, and he actually went into exile quite a bit before the final exiles who came from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. Daniel was taken into exile in Babylon in 605 BC. In other words, one of the earlier exiles, the first time that King Nebuchadnezzar had invaded the land of Judah. He'd kind of taken some exiles to teach the nation a lesson. Daniel was one of them. Obviously, Judah didn't learn the lesson. But meanwhile, Daniel, who must surely have thought that life was over when he was taken into exile in Babylon, discovers his calling in foreign ground, even while the people back in Judah are still turning away from God.
And what is his role there? What does he end up doing?
Well, Nebuchadnezzar was building the greatest empire the world had ever seen.
So this is the king?
The king,
of Babylon.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is aware that if he's going to make the greatest empire the world has ever seen, he needs the greatest talent the world has ever had. So rather than just wipe out the people groups that he's annihilating, he takes their nobility, their most educated people, and he basically has a strategy of get them while they're young, take them to Babylon while they're teenagers, and basically he puts them through secondary school and university. He teaches them the language of Babylon, Aramaic. He teaches them the culture of Babylon. He tries to get them to think the way that Babylonians think. You can see something of his agenda from the fact that Daniel is Daniel's Jewish name. It's his Hebrew name. It's Hebrew for God is my vindicator, or God is my judge. God is going to set things right for me. And King Nebuchadnezzar immediately renames him Belteshazzar, which is Aramaic for the Babylonian idol Bel will stop anything bad happening to King Nebuchadnezzar, which is a bit of a mouthful.
Yes.
But he's basically saying, you used to be a guy who relied on the God of Israel. Let me tell you, you now rely on the Babylonian god Bel, who's all about Nebuchadnezzar and couldn't care less about Jerusalem. So he's got this agenda to take the talent of the world and basically to enlist it to the Babylonian cause. And so in Daniel chapter 1, you find Daniel as a teenager in this kind of secondary school system, being indoctrinated, brainwashed into the thinking of Babylon. And it's there that we pick up the story.
I was going to say, well, how did Daniel feel about having his name changed?
Well, Daniel is a great guy. He's really quite challenging because I think sometimes we can think that Christian witness means being annoying, just being a troublemaker. Daniel really isn't. King Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm going to rename you. The Babylonian king Bel is going to protect me. Daniel's like, do you know what? It's only a name. You can call me what you want. I care about the name of God, not the name of Daniel. He actually doesn't complain at all.
So there are more important things to him.
Exactly. So he starts educating. Nebuchadnezzar starts enrolling Daniel and his friends, his Jewish friends, in this training course, and they're learning pagan studies. They're having to study all the gods of Babylon, and again, some of us might think, well, I must stand up against this. Sometimes Christian political groups can be a bit like this, can't they? They get upset about all sorts of things. Daniel's like, you want to teach me Babylonian culture? I'm really up for learning Babylonian culture because I'm a missionary to Babylon. And the more you tell me about your gods, the easier it will be to evangelize you. See, Daniel doesn't take offense over unimportant things, but there does come a moment where he stands his ground. There's this moment where they introduce some new meals at the school canteen. And the headmaster of the school essentially says, King Nebuchadnezzar has decided that now you will eat food that has been sacrificed to the Babylonian idols, and you will drink that has been sacrificed to the Babylonian idols, in the same way that a non-Christian would not take communion. That is an intensely Christian act. You are participating in worship as you eat. And there was the same implication in Babylon. If you eat the meat and drink from the altar of Bel or Nebo or one of the other gods of Babylon, Marduk and so on, you are essentially saying, I'm a worshipper of that god. Daniel's like, no.
One step too far.
One step too far. Daniel goes vegetarian. I once had a group of Hare Krishna missionaries on the street try and persuade me that Daniel 1 was all about vegetarianism. It really isn't. It's about knowing where a line has been crossed, and where you stop living in a pagan culture and you start participating in a pagan culture. So this is the difference between seeing billboards of semi-naked women as you drive around town and thinking, this is just a factor of me living in this society, and you turning on Netflix and choosing to watch movies where there are naked women in the movie. It's like, Daniel's like, I live in this society, but I'm not participating in this.
So he didn't have the choice, really?
Well, he didn't have any choice, really. The head teacher, the chief official, basically says to him, you've got to eat the meat. If you don't eat the meat, King Nebuchadnezzar will come on school sports day or do the inspection, and he'll see that you're looking punier than the other students in the school, and he will kill you and he will kill me, because that's what the kings of Babylon did. They killed people for a living. The teacher basically says, taking that kind of stand in the school for your God is suicidal. It's unprofessional. Stop it. And Daniel says, nah, I'd rather die than participate in the altar of these idols. And he says to the teacher, he's quite wise, he says, let's do an experiment. It's not going to harm anyone. Let's just take a period of a few days where me, my mate Shadrach, my mate Meshach, my mate Abednego, the four of us, we won't eat any meat at all. We'll just eat Brussels sprouts or whatever vegetables they had. These are the price that Daniel was willing to pay for the gospel. He says, I'll go all vegan. I will eat vegetables. I won't eat the meat, I won't drink the wine. And at the end of however many days, why don't we have a little inspection before King Nebuchadnezzar arrives? So we'll do our own little test pilot, and you can see how the test market goes. And so at the end of the days, the teacher of the school inspects all the students. And Daniel and his friends haven't been eating the meat and drinking the wine, and they are much more healthy than those who have been. It's what the Hare Krishnas were telling me. Vegetarianism does this to you. No, God does this to you. It's like Daniel says, if I take a stand for my God, if I refuse to compromise my faith, then I trust that God isn't in a small box in Jerusalem. God will turn up in Babylon. I won't compartmentalize my life. The God who would have delivered me in Jerusalem will deliver me here in the heart of Babylon. That's the message of Daniel chapter 1.
Okay, what were the repercussions of all that?
Well, it doesn't tell us them all. It says that the teacher says, well, in that case, none of the students in the school are going to drink the wine or eat the meat from the king's table, which probably had a few repercussions when all the other students in the school discover that they've been made to go vegetarian as well. But King Nebuchadnezzar turns up for the sports day to do the inspection. And he looks at Daniel and his friends, and he sees how healthy they're looking. And he basically does a little exam to see who the most gifted students are. And he says to Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, these guys who've put their necks on the line for God, he says to them, you are 10 times better than the other students in this school. And he appoints them to a really senior position in the Babylonian civil service. This is the empire that is about to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And right at the heart, it's a bit like Moses, being infiltrated by God right into the heart of Pharaoh's palace. God infiltrates Daniel and his 3 faithful Jewish friends right into the heart of the Babylonian
Trojan
government.
horse again.
Yeah. It's like God basically says, it looks as though Jerusalem's failed. It looks as though Babylon's won, but I've just inserted Jerusalem into Babylon.
And what did Nebuchadnezzar do?
Well, he's a bit of a slow learner. He has a dream in Daniel chapter 2 where God basically reveals to him that the Babylonian Empire is going to fall, and then the Persian Empire that supplants it is going to fall, and then the Roman Empire is going to come, and Alexander the Great rather will come, and that will fall, and the Romans will come, and they will fall, and then this great kingdom of God will come. It's like this massive prophecy about the coming of Jesus in quite some detail, but Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really learn his lesson. The prophecy that his empire is going to fall contains an image of Nebuchadnezzar as a golden statue. And so in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds this massive golden statue of himself and says to people, unless you worship the golden statue of me, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace and kill you. Which is kind of not really the thing that God was trying to say to him through the dream. Daniel's away. He's in another part of the empire at that point. But his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, take the stand again. They basically say, we would rather die. Throw us in the fiery furnace. They basically say to Nebuchadnezzar, we think our God is able to save, keep, and deliver us. But even if he isn't, we'd rather be burnt to a crisp than to bow down before your image. Nebuchadnezzar's furious. He throws them into the fiery furnace, and then he looks through this kind of glass window into the fiery furnace to watch them being burnt up so that he can celebrate the death of his enemies. And he says to one of his soldiers, didn't I just throw 3 people into the furnace? How come I can see a 4th person in there as well, and his face looks like he's the son of the gods? It's like the other prophets have prophesied that Jesus, the Son of God, will one day come, but Daniel's friends actually see Jesus, the Son of God, as he comes down from heaven early in order to stand with them in their suffering. And they don't get burnt up by the fiery furnace. And in the end, Nebuchadnezzar repents, calls them out. And when he smells them and can't even smell smoke on them, they're not hurt at all. He declares that maybe the Babylonian gods aren't all that, and the God of Israel is the real God.
How does Daniel end up in a lion's den?
Well, that comes a little bit later in the story. What's exciting is Nebuchadnezzar gets saved. He has this moment where he thinks he's the creator rather than the creature. You know, this theme that we've explored throughout these episodes. It's the big theme of the Bible. Are you willing to humble yourself before God, or are you going to pretend you are God? He looks at Babylon, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And he literally says, look at this great city that I have created with my own hands. And immediately God sends him mad, and he lives like a wild animal in the fields for a period. And then God restores his sanity when one day he prays and repents of his sin. And so it feels like Nebuchadnezzar actually gets saved and turns to the God of Israel. His successor, Belshazzar, rather less so. So he calls this massive party, and this is how Daniel ends up in the lion's den. He calls a massive party where Nebuchadnezzar had taken all of the sacred holy cups and bowls from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. And so Belshazzar's having this amazing party, 539 BC. He's having a drunken party. The Persian army is besieging Babylon, but he's so confident that the walls of Babylon are really strong that the Persians will never get in. And so he's having this party, they're all getting drunk, and he says, bring, those gold vessels from Jerusalem so that we can just declare how great our gods are rather than the God of Israel. And as they're drinking from those things, this mysterious hand writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upasim, which means your deeds have been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom's about to be destroyed. And so he's petrified. So he calls his mum. That's what you do when you're petrified. His mum, obviously the widow of Nebuchadnezzar, she comes and says, oh, you got a problem. You need to talk to Daniel. He's an old guy now, but he was the guy who basically advised King Nebuchadnezzar, you need to repent because this doesn't look like the kind of prophecy you want to receive. And so Daniel arrives and explains what it means. And King Belshazzar makes him the prime minister of Babylon on the night that Babylon falls to the Persians. It falls that night to King Darius and King Cyrus of Persia. And they become the new ruler. But immediately they look around and say, who are the gifted leaders around here? We've got an empire going on. We need some good civil servants. Daniel, you're an old guy. You served the king of Babylon for a few years. Why don't you become one of the main rulers in the Persian Empire? And so he does. And he's brilliant. And he believes that the God who turned up in the Babylonian Empire is now going to turn up in the Persian Empire as well. And the non-Jewish leaders within the Persian Empire get jealous that Daniel is so blessed and so popular and so successful. And so they say to King Darius of Persia, we've got this great idea. Why don't you declare that for a whole month, no one is allowed to pray to any god other than you, O king? You get this theme. Are you going to be the creator god, or are you going to admit you're a creature? And so King Darius says, what a great idea. What's not to like about being the only god that's prayed to for a whole month? And Daniel basically hears the decree, goes home, opens his windows so that everybody in the entire street can see what he's doing, and he prays to the God of Israel. And so he's thrown in the lion's den because he's defying the king's command. And the king doesn't really want him to die. He loves Daniel, but obviously he's passed this law. He can't get out of it. And Daniel says to him, I'm trusting my God. I'm trusting that my God's going to rescue me, because God is as powerful on foreign ground as he is in the borders of Israel. And so Daniel's put in the lion's den for a whole night. And it's said that an angel comes and closes the mouths of the lions so that even though they're hungry beasts, there's not even a scratch on him. The following morning, Darius comes back, the king, and says, Daniel, did your God actually save you? And Daniel says, yes, here I am. And so he's brought out of the lion's den, and these enemies of Daniel who've basically tried to manipulate the king says, I know what your game is. And he throws them in the lion's den. And it says before they even touched the ground, the lions had killed them. And then at the end of that chapter, King Darius of Persia proclaims, my God is now going to be the God of Israel. There's this massive theme that if you trust God in unlikely places, God's going to show up and surprise you.
You mentioned Persia and the story of Esther, which is the other book, I think, that we're going to focus on under this title of Foreign Ground.
That's right.
That's all happening in Persia as well. Who is Esther?
Well, Esther is a bit later in the story. So King Darius is around 539 BC, but the Persian Empire lasted a long time. It lasted until the time of Alexander the Great in the 330s BC. So if you remember the movie 300, so you've got King Leonidas and the Spartans, the story actually begins before the invasion of Greece. Esther chapter 1 has King Xerxes, who's the evil king of Persia in the movie 300. He was an evil king, and he was a pretty bad guy, and he was an incredibly imperialistic ruler of Persia. And in Esther chapter 1, he basically holds a party for all of his generals before they invade Greece and attack the Spartans. And he gets drunk, and he's got a really beautiful wife. And as he's drunk, he starts bragging about how sexy his wife is. And he sends messengers to command his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and show off her body to his friends so that everyone can ogle her and everyone can be jealous that he's married to the most beautiful woman in the empire. And she says, no. She says, I'm not going to come down and let you and your drunken mates ogle my body. And he's furious. So he divorces her and he runs off to war. And he loses, as you know, from the movie 300. And then he comes back from the war, having failed, having lost the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salamis. And when he gets home, he's depressed, and his courtiers basically say to him, do you know what you need? A new trophy wife. You need to find another beautiful woman to replace Queen Vashti. Why don't we basically get all the most beautiful women in the empire and turn them into your harem, your majesty, and whoever's the most beautiful woman in your harem, you can make her your new wife instead of Queen Vashti. I mean, it's an abusive situation. It's essentially royal rape. It's horrible. It's domestic abuse. There's nothing nice about this story. It's not where you would expect God to turn up. And it's where God turns up. See, one of the women in the harem is Esther. She is a very, very beautiful Jew. Nobody knows that she's Jewish. She goes into the harem and Xerxes sleeps with her, and he thinks she is so beautiful that he decides she can be the new official wife, the queen, instead of Queen Vashti. And then her cousin Mordecai discovers that there's a plot. The prime minister of Persia has decided he's had enough of the Jews because they won't worship the gods of Persia. It's time to wipe them out. And so Haman, the prime minister of Persia, has got this plot to annihilate the Jews. And essentially Mordecai says to Queen Esther, you've got to do something. You haven't become queen out of coincidence. He basically says, wherever you find yourself is where God wants to use you. He says to her in Esther chapter 4, verse 12, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? The book of Esther is fascinating. It's the only book in the Old Testament that doesn't use the name of God once. Yeah. It's a secular book. It doesn't actually refer to prayer ever. It talks about fasting, so prayer is kind of implied. But this is the one book of the Old Testament that doesn't say the name of God and doesn't talk about prayer. It's intensely secular on purpose. It's meant to replicate your or my life, because we've all got parts of our lives, our job, that group of friends, that family member, different aspects of our lives where we think you're not allowed to be a Christian in that zone. You know, it's unprofessional to bring your faith into the workplace. You know, we can fall for that lie. Or, you know, don't bring faith into politics. You know, this is a secular place of ideas, by which people mean we can bring any ideas we want, but don't inflict your Christianity on me. Basically, Mordecai says to Esther, wherever you are, God has put you there because he wants to do something through you. And so Esther's faced with a challenge. Does she keep her head down in order to live a quiet life? Or does she really believe that God turns up in very unlikely places? And so she does. She basically confronts the prime minister. She risks her own life. She almost gets killed in order to plead with King Xerxes, the bad guy from 300. Please, would you save both me and the Jewish race? And because she does that, she is given a platform to proclaim the gospel of salvation to the nation, all the nations of the Persian Empire. And you discover in Esther 8:17 that not only does God save the Jewish race through Esther's act of courage, it actually says there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration, and many people of other nationalities became Jews too.
Wow.
So these two books of the Bible, I know we spent quite a bit of time on just two books of the Bible. They're really because we live in Babylon. The UK is not a Christian country. It's a secular space. And it's really easy for us to think that our faith in God is important for church and maybe important for family, but certainly not for work or studies or the secular sphere. We live in the equivalent of the Persian Empire. And God basically wants to use both of these two books of the Bible to say, there is not a square inch of planet Earth over which I do not proclaim that's mine. Psalm 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Through these two books of the Bible, God says, trust me, believe in me, that I will show up in unlikely places if you have faith in me.
What happened to both Daniel and Esther, out of interest?
They weren't contemporaries, so Daniel probably died shortly after the time of the lion's den. If he was a teenager in 605 BC, and the lion's den is 539, 538 BC, he's a guy in his 80s by now. So he, as far as we know, died a peaceful death whilst in Babylon. However, before he died, he started praying that God would bring the Jews back from exile. And next time, in our next episode, we're going to talk about how God did that. We're going to talk about how God answered Daniel's final prayer that God would restore the Jews to the promised land. Esther, we don't know. It reaches the end of the story. She has played her part in God's plan. She's still the queen of the Persian Empire. Presumably, she was the mother of the next ruler of the Persian Empire. God basically says, I'm not going to bring you home. I've inserted you in foreign ground, because actually my plan is not just to save the Jewish race. When the Jewish Messiah arrives, there's going to be some surprises. He's not just going to arrive to pat the Jews on the back and to say, you're my chosen people, I'm not interested in the nations of the world. The gospel is going to go out from Jerusalem to every nation, tribe and tongue, and people from every nation of the world are going to come to know me.
But is it the case that even today, we might find ourselves in situations where we have to be reminded that we're there for a reason?
Oh, that's absolutely right. We'll see in the next episode, we're going to look at the life of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah is also in the court of Persia. He's serving a different Persian emperor. He's the royal cupbearer, essentially the guy who has to taste the wine to check none of the king's enemies have poisoned him. So it's not a great job, but you get to talk to the king a lot. And we're going to discover that for him, he's in a different position, and yet God uses his position to make a massive difference. The real theme of this part of the Bible is It looks like tragedy when Jerusalem's destroyed and Babylon seemingly triumphs. But actually, God has just inserted Jerusalem in the midst of Babylon. It looks like disaster when the church in the UK gets smaller and gets weaker, and people even start asking, is there a future for the church? But actually what happens in those moments is your Christian subculture gets destroyed, it gets shattered, and you find yourself in more and more non-Christian contexts. And basically the message of this part of the Bible is God says, that's my plan. I've scattered you because I want you to speak up for me. And when you do, you'll find me in the least expected places.
So next time, we find out how the story continues and take a look at the last 5 books of the Old Testament and the big theme that runs through them.
The first 4 chapters of the book of Ezra are incredibly exciting. Everybody thinks that the dynasty of David is over. And King Cyrus does a little bit of internal investigation and finds a man called Zerubbabel, who is the heir to the dynasty of David. It's like the moment in Lord of the Rings where Strider reveals that he is really Aragorn, son of Arathorn, that the heir to the throne of Gondor is still alive. And everyone thinks, wow, could the kingdom of men have a king once more? And the answer is yes.
Join Phil Moore and myself, David Taverner, for episode 10, Disappointment, the next episode of the Bible Storyline Simplified, based on Phil's book, The Bible in 100 Pages. You can find Phil at philmorebooks.com. Thanks for listening.